And welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my class on the Hieroglyphic Monad or Monas Hieroglyphica of Dr. John Dee. We're jumping in today to a deep dive into Theorem 6, a very important theorem. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. A few housekeeping notes first. You may notice that I have changed how I'm numbering classes. It was getting a little wonky. So from here on out, the class number will just correspond to the theorem we're talking about. When I get to the end of all this, maybe I'll go back and redo the first ones, and maybe I won't. Anyway, what we're doing today in Theorem 6 is talking about a Pythagorean cosmogenesis, and we're also going to get the first view of the Sephiroth on the tree of life. So let's get started. Our earlier videos, and there's a playlist to them below, have focused upon the opening letter to Maximilian, also the context, and we went through the first 5 theorems. The text that Dee is assuming you know and is referring to are Plato's Timaeus, the one we're taking a dive into today, the Sefer Yetzirah, Hermetic, not Rabbinic Kaballah, and the Bible, particularly Genesis and Revelation. So if you haven't watched all of those videos, or if you're not going to watch all those videos, please at least watch the one on context and the 2 previous ones that cover the first 5 theorems, because the theorems build conceptually on each other. Dee, as you have heard me talk about, is taking apart and putting back together this glyph. He's twisting it all kinds of ways. He's projecting it sometimes into 3 dimensions. And this is his, as my co-translator, Dr. Nancy Turner, talks about it often, as it's his symbol of everything. It's his kind of grand unified field theory of the Renaissance. So we're into the theorems. He's explaining them mathematically, magically, kabbalistically, and anagogically. And you know what that means. We ended with Theorem 5. The first light of the philosophers. Quick review, that took us back to the fiat lux, or let there be light of Genesis, as was discussed in Theorem, the very first theorem. And this also is, by the time you get to Theorem 5, bouncing off of Genesis 1:5, 5 and 5. Dee loves these kind of numeric associations. He sees them as more than just coincidence. You can also connect that last theorem to some ideas that we talked about in the letter to King Maximilian, particularly from the Republic, because that's Plato's idea of a philosopher king, and he's appealing to Maximilian as a philosopher king. So particularly books 5 to 8 of the Republic. The ideas of light, shade, and a boundary. There's Plato's famous allegory of the cave in there. And then there's also, to shift context, the concept of a second tree of light, not the one created by the 10 emanations of powers of God, but the shade of that, the qliphothic tree. So that's where we left off. And here we are at Theorem 6. I'm just going to read through the first sentence here. Here we see the sun, you know his symbol for the sun, gold, Tiferet, and moon, symbol for the moon, supported by a rectilinear cross, which appropriately enough can signify a hieroglyphic account. We've talked about what a hieroglyph means. I've got a link to a wordplay video on that below, but not an Egyptian hieroglyph. This comes from the ancient Greek word for sacred, same you get in hierarchy or hierophant. Glyph, we have that as a word in English, so sacred symbol. This is a sacred seal. He calls it his Hermetic seal of London. A hieroglyphic account of the ternary as well as the quaternary. I gave you some homework to look up those words last time, or make sure you knew them. I'll just run through them real quickly. Ternary is composed of 3. So here you might think, knowing Dee's very Christian persona, why doesn't he say Trinity? Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Well, the Trinity would have a specific meaning, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And a ternary is any group of 3. So the Trinity is one ternary. We're going to get to eventually what a ternary is in Plato's Timaeus here. A quaternary then will be composed of 4. You can also have a quinary composed of 5, like your fingers. There's even a biquinary, which would be like 10. A hex, a hexagon, a hexahedra, 6. Septenary, sometimes that's a septad, but that's pertaining to a group of 7. An octad is going to be 8. We'll skip 9 and just go to a decad pertaining to 10. So the tetractys, for example, is a decad. It's one in a Pythagorean cosmogenesis that you might think of the most. That is that pyramid where you have a dot at the top, then 2, then 3, then 4. You add up 1, 2, 3, 4. You get 10 on any side, and also the point at the top. The monad is considered a higher order decad, something else we've talked about in an earlier video. Okay, so that's the first line. We're going to get a hieroglyphic account of the ternary and the quaternary. That's what we're going to have here. We're going to remember the wordplay in Latin on rectilinear, because his word for line in Latin after the first theorem is recta. So that can be a straight line, it can be a straight edge, like in a Euclidean compass and straight edge transformations. It can be a right angle, and it always is a play on recta, from where we get the English word rectitude, good, upright. And in the sense D is using it, it is an aspiring back to the Platonic concept of the good, because he's a Neoplatonic writer. Okay, so we'll continue on here. He says, assuredly, this glyph refers to the ternary by means of the 2 straight lines, there they are, and the seemingly copulative point there in the middle that they share. Flash forward this little point here and that point, he's going to transform back and forth between in later theorems. But why does he call this a copulative point? Well, he's interested in generation, in generative functions, right? It's a cosmogenic text. Then he says at the same time it's a quaternary by the 4 straight lines. That is, if you now drop out that point, which is 0 dimensions, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 lines and 1, 2, 3, 4 right angles. So they're singular, 1 line, twice, 2, and then 3 ternary, 4 quaternary. There's another allusion there, 1, 2, 3, 4, to the tetractys. 1, 2, 3, 4 will always be an allusion to the tetractys. In the same way, in the same place, an octad even now very secretly presents itself. How is that? Well, remember, I've talked about how you need to flip parts of this glyph around. Sometimes that's flipping it dimensionally, like you flip this circle into a sphere. Sometimes you flip parts around in the same plane. So what happens if you flip these 4 right angles around so the center part is on the outside? You get a square. A square has 4 right angles. Now, what happens if you flip a square into 3D? You get a cube. So there's some interesting things here about what's going on. This has 4 right angles in a square. When you get a cube or a regular hexagon, there's 8 vertices. That is, the right angle 2 lines, instead it becomes 3 faces meeting at 1 vertex, and there are 8 vertices. So that's the most basic octad that he's referring to here. A cube's vertices then become another ternary. There's 3 of them, and the number of them becomes that becomes the hidden octad. So it's a doubling of this 4. Now, just as if to underscore that doubling, D is going to tell you this same thing in a different doubled way at the end of the theorem. So notice that when we get there. Also, later on, we will see how this octad can refer to a kind of celestial event, but that won't be until many theorems from now. So that's what he's meaning when he says, in a way which I doubt our predecessors, the Magi, ever observed, and which you will much note. The magical ternary of the first fathers and wise ones corresponds to the body, spirit, and soul, from which place we have here a manifest principle septenary pertaining to 7. Where is 7 in here? This center, this point that was dislocated, it's now the center point of this cube, just like this, if you made it a sphere, would be the center of that sphere. So the center of the cube is a septenary point, out of 2 straight lines and a common point, and then out of the 4 straight lines that are separated by 1 point. All right, here we have a strange ternary, body, spirit, and soul. It doesn't sound like it corresponds to Father, Son, Holy Ghost, the Christian Holy Trinity. So we're going to come to that and look at the original Latin after we take a minute and pause and just consider the cube. People in sacred geometry do all kinds of things now with the cube. There are all these cube of space mysteries. So it's a very big deal if you're studying sacred geometry today, but it is back then too. So you notice that it has 6 square faces, 3 meted 8 vertices, but it has 12 edges. Okay, we are going to see in this theorem why D equates spatial and time measurements. All right, so the cube has 12 edges. What has 12 in terms of moving temporal measurements? Well, 12 months in a year, of course, and there's 12 signs in the zodiac. And there's my phone, which I'm going to turn off. Okay, 12 hours in a day, or 12 hours in a half day, double them and get 24 hours in a day. There's 24 theorems going on here. After that, I'm just turning off my phone, which, you know, do you ever have those people in a class who say, turn off your phone? There's a reason. Sorry about that. Okay, regular platonic solid. It's the one usually referred to the element earth. Now, as we're going to see in the Timaeus, this will be the earth of in the world of becoming, not the earth in the world of perfect forms, but hang on, and we're getting there. It's a dual to the octahedron. What we mean by that is easier to just show you. So if this blue thing out here, that's a cube, right? It's an octahedron is what is inside of it. If this cube were a sphere, we would say it is inscribed, but we're instead going to talk about it as the dual. So notice that this vertex is hitting the middle of this cube's face. We could put another octahedron outside, and we could put another cube outside of that, three-dimensionally, fractally out to infinity, or smaller and smaller inside to infinity. It's fascinating the way that these forms nest inside each other. Okay. There are other things you can do with a cube. If you take it apart in a certain way, it looks like a cross. You will also have a lot of fun with that. But if you are considering these forms in the way I'm talking about, you are doing geometry the ancient Greek way. All right, you're contemplating and visualizing these forms. It's not that much different than what a ceremonial magician does when that person casts, say, 12 pentagrams, and that are pentagons, and they form into a dodecahedron. These things fit perfectly together. I said I was going to look at this in Latin, and that is because of these words: body, spirit, soul. Not Father, Son, Holy Ghost. In fact, the word for spirit, spiritu or spiritus, usually is translated from Latin into English as either spirit or soul. But the word that D is using, anima, when he uses that word, it's often, very, very often, referring us back to something in Greek philosophy. Why is that? It's because of the idea of the whole world being animate. That's where we get this word in English, anima. Everything is sort of filled with the divine. You might think of it as a pantheistic view of the universe in a certain sense. So, and the cosmos itself has a body. That's something that comes right from the Timaeus. It doesn't come from the Bible, for example, although D will conflate the two together. Something else that, well, you might think about if you've studied Hermetic Kaballah at all, is you might have thought, well, you keep talking about this ternary, Terry, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, or body, spirit, soul. Couldn't that be the upper three Sephiroth, Kether, Chokmah, Bina? Well, yes, it can be, and we'll get to that, but that's getting ahead of things a bit here. But it's the odd Latin that in this case is really pointing us to some Greek work, and the main context will be Timaeus. Also notice the wise ones and the first fathers. It's not God, for example. It's the first fathers and the wise ones. Well, this could be the Magi, right, at the birth of Jesus, but a more likely allusion is to the wise craftsman in Timaeus because of the body, which is like the cosmos, in Timaeus, which is animated and has a soul as it is being created. So in this Pythagorean cosmogenesis, what we want to do is see what would a quaternary, a ternary, a septenary, and an octad be. We're going to do that over the next several theorems. Because what I want you to do is, first of all, remember what we talked about in the context video. This is one of the big contexts, and Plato's Timaeus is as much or more of a context, actually, as biblical Genesis. You could even argue very easily that he uses Genesis less than the Timaeus. He certainly does in these first 10 theorems. So to some contemporary Christians, particularly fundamentalists who are interested in a literal translation, this may seem very non-Christian to you. If it does, I'm sorry. There is a problem in English with even talking about literal biblical translation, because you ought to be talking about something in Hebrew or the New Testament in Greek, but that's another topic for another time. This is supposed to be Plato. Here, this is actually a painting by Raphael. It's a little anachronistic. The book that Plato is holding is the Timaeus, because he's talking about in the beginning, the first things. And that is what goes on in the Timaeus. D's anagogical exegesis. All right, an anagogical exegesis, remember, in the Middle Ages is the highest form of a scriptural exegesis, pertaining often to the Gnostic assent of the one. His is really a Neoplatonic restoration of the good via sacred geometry, much more than a typical anagogical exegesis. So it's based more upon the Timaeus and the Kaballah than anything else. I'm going to give you a brief explanation here, but you're going to understand this more if you've explored this beautiful text. It's one of the most beautiful and complicated of Plato's works. It's unlike any of his other writing in that it's a monologue. We think of Platonic dialogues, Socratic dialogues with Plato. That's not what happens here. Socrates is there. There's a brief conversation with Critias about Atlantis. Yes, this is the dialogue that is in. And then Timaeus just goes into this likely story of creation, which matches hand in glove with Pythagorean thought. It's one of the very first, probably the first, of Plato's works to appear in Latin. Cicero refers to it, and it certainly is around by the 4th century, and then other works build upon it. So the idea of a ternary that we're going to get here is going to be based on what is called the receptacle in Timaeus, if you have studied it. Those ideas are still debated by philosophers today, but what I'm going to do is give you a simple and hopefully not too simplistic idea of it. The quaternary is going to be the 4 elements, and not the 4 elements in our physical world, which is going to be the world of becoming, but in the perfect world of forms. And let's talk about that a little bit more and how that happens in the Timaeus. So you have the wise craftsman as the creator. The wise craftsman creates this eternal world of forms. This is a world of being. It doesn't change. You can associate it with spatial measurements, among many, many other things. From that, the craftsman is going to create the universe, the cosmos. We get our English word cosmos from this word cosmos, but spelled with Greek letters. The craftsman creates the cosmos, and it is in a constant state of motion. It's constantly becoming. Our thoughts, when they revolve, remember dianoia from the letter to Maximilian? They are thoughts in the world of becoming, even constantly revolve. The cosmos uses as its model the eternal world of forms, the world of eternal being. This is why, okay, underline, this is why contemplating perfect geometric forms is a sacred act. If you are an ancient Greek person, doing geometry, it's a sacred act. You're contemplating the eternal world of forms. And D, as the preeminent expert on Greek in his in the British Isles in his time knows this very, very well. So this creator is an artist or a craftsman using the particular Greek word techne. And the creation is a work of art, and it's good because the creator knows that he is good. And so the idea of creating the cosmos is having good, in Latin the bonitatis, as the ultimate goal. That creation is going to strive to imitate and eventually return to the eternal world of being. The way that the craftsman creates the cosmos is the bulk of Timaeus. He explains how it's created according to element, number, and geometry. So the craftsman looks to this eternal, changeless world of forms and does his best to create a similar form in the world of becoming that is in constant flux. So the universe, or this cosmos, is a being shaped like a sphere, and it's endowed with intelligence. It's this great conscious form that manifests in a way that our minds, once we get stepped down all the way to his, a human body, that we can only partially comprehend, but we try by contemplating these eternal forms. I mentioned it shaped like a sphere. The first part of the body, the most important part of the body, is going to be the head because it's sphere-like. The most important sense will be sight because the eyes are orbs that are sphere-like. Although what you are trying to see is not something physical. In the Timaeus, then, Timaeus, or Plato's version of him, takes us through this complicated mixing process in his story about how the universe is created. And in the next slide, we'll see how that starts to involve the Platonic solids. So the creator introduces the idea of a third kind, or a receptacle. So our ternary will be the eternal world of forms. That's spatial, the physical world that's in constant motion and is a little off. Let me give you an easy example. So a circle has 360 degrees. You remember that from geometry class, right? A year has 365 days. It's a little off, but almost there. By the way, Dee does a lot of work trying to rectify the calendar, which I've talked about briefly in another video. So this discussion in the Timaeus about the receptacle is one of the most argued about passages in literature and philosophy to this day. I mean, trust me, I'm a retired professor of languages and literature. I remember 10 years ago when my best friend was going off to a conference on the Timaeus, a whole conference, and a big discussion there was still the receptacle. The reason is the kernel of the discussion is whether Timaeus is talking literally or metaphorically, kind of like the literal versus metaphorical discussions people have about the Bible. In the Timaeus, you only get a discussion of the receptacle in terms of analogy, not what it actually is. We know it's this thing that takes images. Oh, like the monad is an image, right? It takes images of the eternal worlds of form and translates them to this world of motion. But we don't have the precise mechanics of how. Instead, it's compared to like a mother and a father that create offspring. Oh, like in the Emerald Tablet, right? The sun is its father, the moon is its mother, and they create this one thing. It's exactly like the Emerald Tablet, except frankly, the Emerald Tablet is a little simpler. Sometimes it's compared to a lump of gold, several other things that include seats. And the way you say that in Greek, hydra is where we get our terms for polyhedra or various hedron like tetrahedron, hexahedrons, and so on. So the receptacle is where being and becoming are mixed in different proportions, and that becomes the ternary. And from it will come the first forms. Now we're going to see how that all is projected upon the monad. In Pythagorean thought, the monad is drawn this way, not with all the other stuff D adds onto it. So the idea with this symbol of the monad that D certainly knows and is certainly using in his hieroglyphic monad is you have the wise craftsman creating the universe as a spinning sphere. So this circle in Pythagorean thought is representing a spinning sphere. It's an imitation of the perfect one. Oh, monad. Then the wise craftsman is going to put the world soul in the center, and it will fill the sphere. Okay, so everything is made of this God stuff, or this divine stuff. So then the wise craftsman combines two kinds of sameness, two kinds of difference, two kinds of being. Oh, yes, that's 6, and we're in theorem 6. Then subdivides difference into 6 parts, and they have 7 unequal circles. Oh, that's the hidden septenary again. And where are we going to see this most? With the 7 classical planets. Not the number we have today, but the 7 classical planets. So if you've seen these drawings where there's spheres and spheres, and you get the harmony of the spheres, those are the ancient Greek wandering stars, which is their planets, because you see them moving around in the sky, and they are gods. Then you get the creation of other gods, and the function of these gods is to create order in this chaos that is the cosmos. And by contemplating that order with your faculty of reason, one becomes more like the eternal, and one starts to return to the good. There is this implicit assumption that all creation is part of this God stuff. It's just some of it isn't ordered very well. So then the wise craftsman goes through this complex process where he divides different things following a bunch of precise mathematical proportions, which you can read about yourself if you're interested in. He cuts the compound lengthwise. He fixes the resulting 2 bands in their middle, like the letter X or a chi. Oh, like our rectilinear cross. I mean, that's an X if you just tilt it, right? And then they connect at their ends. How would this be, since this is the X? Well, this end will connect there. This end will connect there. So you have 2 circles. You also have this symbol we use in mathematics for infinity. Once you get the 2 circles, if you push them in, we'll see this in a later theorem, they become like a vesica piscis, an image often associated with generative functions. Also, it's a lens where the 2 circles cross. Think of Dee's interest in optics. So the heavenly bodies move in their various orbits, and they serve as markers of time, days, months, years. So creation, per Plato's Timaeus, is a moving image of eternity. Just let that sink in, because it's a beautiful image. It's a moving image of eternity, that all of this motion through the images connected by the receptacle gives us this moving image of the world of perfect form. This also is the implicit rationale for equating spatial and temporal measures. The planets then help regulate moral life in the human striving to return to the good. Timaeus will link each of the elements that come from Empedocles. Sometimes we think of Platonic or Aristotelian elements, but actually the first philosopher we know of to mention them was Empedocles, so that hence Empedoclean elements. But Timaeus links them to solids: earth to a cube, air to an octahedron, water to an icosahedron, fire to a tetrahedron, like this. So each of these hedra means seats. So each of these polyhedra, or multiple hedras, can be composed of triangles. This is a very important thing. And oh, triangle, there's a ternary, right? Now I have talked about them as 30, 60, 90, or 40, 45, 45, 90 triangles, because that's, you know, what you do in high school geometry and we're most familiar with. That's not how Timaeus talks about them, but that's what they are. And Timaeus says that all of these structures can be built with triangles, but then he talks about air, fire, and water, and not earth. I'm going to talk about fire, since it is the simplest of the Platonic solids. And it is the one that, well, literally fires the other alchemically. So you have a triangle, 3. You have 4 triangles, a quaternary, you get a tetrahedron, the first Platonic solid associated with fire. If you split this equilateral triangle in 2, you get a semi-equilateral triangle, 45, 45, 90. And you get the same thing with water. If you split this equilateral triangle right in two, same kind of triangle, same thing with air, split it in two, you have a 45, 45, 90 triangle. So Timaeus tells us this is why air, fire, and water can each turn into one another. And once you get into the world of becoming, not the world of perfect forms, it's sometimes hard to tell what is air, what is water, what is fire, because they can turn into each other. Now, I find it kind of fascinating that people looking at ancient Greek alchemy don't look at this more, because this is an alchemical process. Air can turn into fire, can turn into water, but what they can't turn into is earth. They only mix with earth. Why is that? Because if you split this into a triangle, you don't get the same kind of triangle. You get a 30, 60, 90 triangle. All of this matches all of the things that Pythagoras says, for example, in his theorem. All right, because the triangles make these solids, you get an idea of alchemy, but you may also be thinking, hey, wait, isn't there another form? Why, yes, there is. There's the ether, usually associated with the dodecahedron, and it's in the Timaeus that you get the idea of there being a fifth figure, and you're told the fifth figure is made out of 12 pentagons, and then you can also cut this up into triangles, but they won't match the half equilateral triangles you get in these three either. You get the idea that, well, Timaeus says there is a fifth figure made of 12 pentagons. That would be this, the dodecahedron, and God used this as a model for the 12-fold division of the zodiac. That will become very important in just a couple of theorems. But for now, just that one reason that this is associated with the ether and is most sacred, because it's most like a sphere, and the cosmos is a sphere. You can have endless fun studying these figures, and believe me, I have. I hope you have or will too. This is probably a good time, though, to thank my sponsor, Geometric Models, because they are the people who made this particular graphic. They have wonderful teaching posters to help you learn sacred geometry. Some are manipulables, like this great torus. Yes, we'll find a torus later on in these theorems, although supposedly people didn't know about them in that time period. It appears John D. did. So we're through Theorem 6 in terms of Plato's Timaeus. But wait, there's more. We have one more context to bring in. That is the whole tree of life. So before you grab your head and think, oh my God, Terry, how am I supposed to know all of this? You aren't. It's the reverse. D is assuming that you know this already, and he is creating this basically as a mnemonic device and a magical seal, but a mnemonic device to collapse these different forms of cosmogenesis together and remember their similarities. So my function is to tell you what he assumes you already know here. I do want to just tell you kind of parenthetically that in the Renaissance, people had memories that were way better than ours because they had to memorize so much stuff. There is a whole art of memory. Francis Yates has a book called The Art of Memory. Or think of the plight of a Shakespearean actor. You're performing 5 different plays and you have to have all of those lines memorized. How are you going to do that? Well, through the art of memory. You might imagine you're in a sphere, divided up by the zodiac. Divide that up by all kinds of Agrippan magical correspondences. That is, say, Agrippan magical correspondences doing something like Tifereth, sun, gold, etc., isn't just used for magic. It's used to remember things and to store things away through this art of memory. Okay, so in this class, I'm simply going to remind you of it. Theorems 1 to 10 are eventually going to refer us to the 10 Sephiroth. I'll have a whole video on that, and that video will be the one on Theorem 10, where I'll be bringing those ideas in more. But if you have some background in Hermetic, again, not Rabbinic, but Hermetic Kaballah, Our discussion ought to pretty much match what you've already studied, particularly if you're using this tree, often called the Kircher tree after Athanasius Kircher, who is a century after Dee. But I would make the argument that Kircher's tree, since he is grabbing so much stuff from Dee, is the same one Dee is using. Of course, Dee's great Kabbalistic work is lost. But I will walk you through it. For now, just remember that perspective is everything. Back in Theorem 3, we saw how when Dee says the earth is the center of all things, it's geocentric simply in the sense that you are on earth and we're looking at how things go around you. Similarly, you are in Malkuth, which would be associated with earth. The planet, not the perfect Platonic form, although its image can also be associated here. Yesod would be the moon, Tifereth, the sun. Now, if you have studied knowledge lectures like those published by Israel Regardi in the 30s and used by various Kabbalistically based initiatory societies like the mini Golden Dawn spin-offs, or in different form and revised somewhat by the AA or the Aurum Solus or Boda or the Society of Inner Life. Yes, all of those things that you learned will apply here until you start getting into minutia, but the basic form is the same. Remember that if you are thinking of perspective, you can't perceive the higher until you understand the lower, even though the lower is more imperfect. So you have to constantly revise the lower as you can see the higher and lower are themselves metaphors. So on Earth, what is the largest celestial object you can see? From Malkuth, it would be Tifereth, associated with the sun. We've had in an earlier theorem how sometimes the moon, associated with Yesod, looks the same, but it's simply because it's closer. Okay, those are the kind of things that Dee will be doing, but I'm going to defer the discussion of that until we get to Theorem 10. Theorem 6, the one we've talked about, will be referred to Tifereth. And it is the first time that the reader becomes aware, if you knew Hermetic Kaballah really well and you're reading through, it would be Theorem 6 where you get this aha, like, oh, could this refer to Tifereth also? Well, think of why that would be. Because from Malkuth, you can perceive, from the earth, you can perceive the sun. You can't perceive this place where the Big Bang happened, or where first light enters, or where that stillbone, as we talked about Mercury and stillbone, pierces the one and creation is formed. Okay, sometime between now and Theorem 10, I'll also have that video where I show you why I'm pretty certain that the so-called Kircher tree is the tree Dee uses. But for now, the takeaway I want you to have from this class is simply that what the ternary and quaternary are in terms of the Timaeus, and how you flip the octad and get a cube. If you can do that, you will also see how he is flipping parts of this around all of the time in every theorem. I also said I'd have a gift for you. Here's my gift. I mentioned that the last scholarly translator of the Monad, C.H. Yaston, back in the year I was born, a long time ago, 1964, he was sure that while this was a work of alchemical transformation, but he said that the specific meaning that Dee tries to convey by his explanation in these theorems is lost, that Dee is talking to a bunch of mystics and initiates, and we just don't have their secrets. The sad thing here is that Yaston, who was such a brilliant man, everyone believed him because he knew a lot. But my rare gift for you, raritatis, remember that means a succinct thing like the monad is, a succinct thing that is very complicated, we might say. You've got all the secrets if you have a surface understanding of Genesis and how Genesis prefigures Revelation. That's all over the internet, but I will also provide that. A surface, and I do mean surface, understanding of Hermetic Kaballah, a surface understanding of the Timaeus and related ideas of Pythagorean thought like a Tetractys or a Vesica Piscis, and a willingness per the Sefer Yetzirah, where the alphabet of Hebrew creates all things. So a surface understanding of letters and shapes has things that create the universe, and you treat letters themselves as geometric principles. Okay. Your homework, now I say this knowing that usually professors give homework and folks don't do them, but it's please read or at least listen to a summary of Plato's Timaeus. I mean, you don't have to, but it is a fascinating work, and John D. seems to think you know it very, very well. All right, so that's all we're going to do with Theorem 6. Next time I will be back with Theorem 7, and we are going to talk about magical flux. Woo! I'll see you then. Bye-bye.